There is a door. It is wooden, with a small pane of glass near the top, fogged from the inside by warmth and breath. Above it, a bell hangs on a bent iron strip. Not decorative, not welcoming in any modern sense, just functional. A signal that says someone has arrived and the grocer needs to know. You push the door open. The bell sounds, a thin, dry ring that has been ringing in the same spot for perhaps 15 years. The floor answers beneath your feet, a creak that is specific to this building, to this board, at this exact weight and step. If you came in often enough, you would know which board it was without looking. This is 1925. There is no parking lot outside because most people did not drive here. They walked. Some came by horse. A few arrived on the early delivery trucks that had begun replacing wagons on the better roads. But most came on foot, which means the store exists at the scale of walking distance, which means it exists at the scale of the neighborhood, the block, the particular cluster of families who depend on it. The average American household in 1925 spent roughly 1/3 of its entire income on food. Not entertainment, not clothing, not rent. Food. 1/3 of everything earned going back out the door in exchange for flour, coffee, salt pork, and potatoes. That number tells you something about what this store meant. It was not a convenience. It was the center of a household's survival math. The interior is narrow by modern standards. Most independent grocery stores in a small American town occupied somewhere between 400 and 800 square feet, a modest living room by today's measure. In some towns, the store might be wider and deeper, but the feeling was always the same. Everything close, everything visible, everything within reach of the man behind the counter. And there is always a counter. That is the first thing you notice after the smell. The counter runs across the back or across one full side, and it is a solid thing, wood, worn smooth at the edges where thousands of hands have rested. On your side, customers, requests, money. On the other side, the goods, the grocer, the work. This is not a design choice. It is a statement about how commerce functioned. You did not walk the aisles in 1925. There were no aisles. You stated your needs, and the grocer gathered them. This system had been in place, essentially unchanged since the colonial era. It assumed that the merchant knew the stock better than the customer did, that the merchant's hands were part of the transaction, and that trust between buyer and seller was personal, built over time, visit by visit. Behind the counter, there were shelves, bins, barrels, and drawers, flour and sacks, sugar in a barrel or a wooden box, coffee beans in a bin or pre-ground in tins if the store stocked a brand, rice measured from a metal scoop, crackers in a large tin sold by weight, beans, cornmeal, oats, all in bulk, all scooped to order. The smell of the place was its own catalog: coffee and flour and soap, cured meat, sharp vinegar from a barrel of pickles, the faint sweetness of dried fruit, and below all of it, something older, the smell of wood and grain and work, the smell of a building that had been absorbing commerce for years. His name was probably something like William, or Henry, or George. In some neighborhoods, it was Giuseppe, or Heinrich, or Abramowitz, names that arrived with immigration and planted themselves into the corners of American towns. He had likely been doing this for years. The independent grocer in 1925 was not a corporate employee following a script. He was a small businessman, operating on thin margins in a competitive environment, managing relationships with suppliers, customers, and the town's informal credit economy simultaneously. According to economic data from the era, more than a quarter of all food retailers in 1929 had annual sales below $5,000. After covering merchandise, rent, and operating costs, the owner of such a store might have cleared a few $100s in profit, less than he would have earned working for someone else. He stayed anyway. Because the store was also a home in most cases. Many grocers lived above or behind the shop. The business and the household were not separate institutions. The store's success was the family's comfort. Its debts were the family's debts. A sack of flour that went musty, a barrel of apples that rotted too quickly. These were not inventory losses recorded in a spreadsheet. They were meals that the grocer's own children would not eat. He arrived early, before customers. He checked produce by hand, lifting each head of lettuce, turning each apple. He checked the icebox if he had one, because butter and meat could not be trusted to good intentions in warm air. He checked the stock by eye, because in 1925 there was no inventory system, no barcode scanner, no automated reorder alert. He knew what was low because he had watched it go low, scoop by scoop, sale by sale. His memory was his system. A woman arrives with a list. She has folded and unfolded it several times since she wrote it. It is soft at the creases. She does not browse. There is nothing to browse, nothing within reach, nothing she can pick up and examine and put back. She reads from her list, and the grocer moves. Flour first. He reaches the scoop into the sack, a large wooden-handled metal scoop, and fills it, levels the top with a practiced motion, and pours it into a paper bag. He weighs it on a counter scale. Brass weights are set onto the other tray, slid and adjusted until the beam balances flat. He records the weight or folds the bag without writing, depending on his habit, and sets it to the side. Sugar. He is careful with sugar. Sugar is expensive, and sugar is money, and the scale is a moral instrument as much as a commercial one. A grocer who cheated weights was not just committing fraud, he was destroying the only thing the store ran on: trust. In a town where everyone knew everyone, that kind of reputation spread in a single afternoon. Coffee. If she wants it ground, he turns the grinder, a fixed cast-iron machine bolted to the counter or to a shelf with a hand crank that takes effort. The beans feed in from a hopper above and come out below, already fragrant, filling the store with a smell that hits differently at 8 in the morning than it does at noon. Coffee in 1925 was not casual for every household. It was a small luxury. Buying it meant the family was still holding. The transaction continues. Potatoes, measured out from a bin. A small piece of salt pork cut from a larger slab. Onions, perhaps a tin of something, baked beans or condensed milk, if the store stocked it and she could manage the price. Each item is weighed or measured. Each item is wrapped or bagged or set aside. The counter fills with small bundles, each one the result of a specific exchange between a specific request and a specific human set of hands. Nothing is pre-packaged. Nothing is standardized. Everything is personal. There is a book on a shelf behind the counter. It is thick, cloth-bound, worn at the corners. The pages are ruled with faint blue lines, and the handwriting inside is the grocer's own. A mix of neat columns and hurried scrawl, depending on how busy the day had been. This is the ledger. In many independent groceries of this era, credit sales accounted for a significant portion of total business. In the poorest city neighborhoods, economic historians have noted credit could represent 70 to 80% of a grocer's transactions. Even in working class and middle-income areas, buying on account was standard practice. A family would accumulate a tab across several visits and settle it on payday, or after harvest, or when circumstances allowed. The ledger was not a credit score.
It was something older and more personal than that. It was reputation, written down. The grocer knew which families were reliable. He knew whose husband worked steadily and whose had recently lost a shift at the mill. He knew whether a farmer's summer crop had been good. He knew when a family had been hit by illness because the pattern of their purchases changed. Less meat, smaller amounts, longer gaps between visits. These observations were not data points. They were pieces of a life he had been watching for years. Extending credit was a constant negotiation between kindness and survival. If he refused credit harshly when a family was genuinely struggling, he damaged his standing in the community. He saw these people at church. Their children went to school together. A refusal would be remembered. But if he extended credit too freely and too many accounts went unpaid, the store went under. There was no corporate safety net, no parent company to absorb the loss, just the grocer and his ledger, and the gap between what was owed and what would actually be paid. He carried that weight every day. Payment often came in patterns. In mill towns and factory towns, payday arrived on a fixed schedule, and the grocer felt it without needing to consult a calendar. On those days, the store was busier. Debts were settled, at least partially. The cash drawer grew heavier. In farming communities, the rhythm followed the harvest. A family might run a tab from May through October, and then come in after the corn sold and clear most of what they owed. The grocer had to believe in that settlement. He had to extend credit across 6 months of uncertainty on the promise of a harvest that weather and markets could undermine at any moment. That kind of belief was not sentimental. It was the operating principle of the entire system.
A modern person stepping into a 1925 grocery store would recognize some of it immediately and find the rest almost unreadable. The familiar things: flour, sugar, coffee, salt, soap, canned tomatoes, crackers, beans, oats. These were the backbone foods: cheap, filling, storable, familiar. A household could be fed for weeks on what was tied up in a few paper bundles of rice, cornmeal, and dried beans. The unfamiliar things: loose tea measured by the quarter ounce, because tea was expensive and a household might need only a pinch. Molasses drawn slowly from a large container into a jar the customer brought herself, thick and dark, trailing from the ladle like something reluctant to leave. Saltfish in some stores, especially in towns with certain immigrant communities or coastal traditions. Vinegar measured out from a barrel, pumped into a small bottle. Lye soap for laundry and floors, sold alongside branded bars that were beginning to appear on shelves. Kerosene, a shelf of it, because many homes still ran on lamps, not electricity. Spices came in small paper packets or were measured out by the pinch. Pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, mustard, each in its own container, each with its own small scoop. A household might buy enough nutmeg to last a season, enough cinnamon to get through a few weeks of oatmeal. These were not pantry staples in the way they are now. They were small extravagances, bought in tiny amounts, used carefully. Butter was cut from a larger block. The grocer used a wire or a knife, weighed the piece, adjusted it, then wrapped it in wax paper folded tight at the edges. The customer hurried it home to the icebox or the coolest corner of the house, because butter in summer was a race against temperature. Cheese came the same way, a wheel or a block on the counter, a wedge cut to order, weighed and wrapped. No plastic, no vacuum seal, just paper and the customer's speed getting it home. Canned goods were becoming more common by 1925. Tomatoes, peaches, corn, sardines, baked beans, condensed milk. The tin can had been commercially practical for several decades by this point. and its presence in the store meant something important: food that did not depend on weather tomorrow. Food that could wait on a shelf and be opened in January when the garden had been dormant for 3 months. In a household without refrigeration, canned goods were security.
While the independent grocer ran his store on memory and trust and a ledger worn at the corners, something else was already moving through the country. It was moving fast. The Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, known everywhere simply as A&P, had begun as a mail-order tea business in New York in 1859. By the early 20th century, it was expanding at a speed that had no precedent in American retail. Between February 1922 and February 1925, according to business records from the era, A&P opened an average of 7 new stores every single day. By 1925, it operated nearly 14,000 locations across the United States, with combined sales of roughly $440 million. 14,000 stores in 1 year. The A&P economy format was deliberately stripped down. Small footprint, secondary street location, minimal staff, no credit, no delivery, cash only. The elimination of credit and delivery cut operating costs dramatically, and those savings went into lower prices. For a working-class household trying to stretch a paycheck, A&P's prices were hard to argue with. But the independent grocer had something A&P could not manufacture. He knew your name. He knew which cut of bacon you preferred. He knew when your family had been sick. He knew when you needed more time on your account and when you were good for it. The chain store manager was an employee following a system. The independent grocer was a neighbor extending trust on his own judgment. The tension between those two models would define American grocery retail for the next 2 decades. Independent grocers didn't simply accept defeat. In 1926, a group of independents in the northeastern United States banded together to form the Independent Grocers Alliance, the IGA, specifically to pool purchasing power and compete with the chains on price, without surrendering the personal service model. It was a recognition that something was being lost, and an attempt to slow the loss.
Nine years before 1925, a man named Clarence Saunders had already pointed at the future. On September 11, 1916, Saunders opened a grocery store at 79 Jefferson Avenue in Memphis, Tennessee, and called it Piggly Wiggly, the name he refused to explain. When someone once asked him directly why he had chosen it, Saunders replied, "So people will ask that very question." The store looked nothing like what you have just been imagining. There was no counter. There was no grocer waiting to assemble your order. Instead, customers picked up a wooden basket at the entrance, passed through a turnstile, and walked through 4 continuous aisles of open shelves. Every item was individually price-marked, a radical concept at the time, because in most stores, prices were quoted by the clerk and could vary customer by customer, day by day. At Piggly Wiggly, every customer paid the same price for the same item. At the end of the aisles, they reached a cashier, paid, and passed through another turnstile on the way out. They had selected their own goods. This sounds unremarkable today. It was revolutionary in 1916. Regional grocers in Memphis predicted it would fail. Customers would not want to gather their own things, they said. They would find it undignified. They would prefer the familiar ritual of handing a list to a clerk and waiting. Within a few months, Piggly Wiggly was generating $80,000 more than the average competing grocery store over the same period, while operating with a fraction of the labor costs. By the end of that first year, there were 9 Piggly Wiggly locations in the Memphis area. By 1923, there were 1,267 stores in the chain, and Saunders had listed the company on the New York Stock Exchange. Saunders also secured a patent on the self-service format itself. patent number 1,242,872, granted on October 9, 1917. He patented the store design. He patented the price tagging system. He patented the printed receipt. He was not simply opening a new store, he was engineering an entirely new system of commerce and protecting it the way an inventor protects an invention. The idea spread. Imitators appeared immediately. Stores with names like Handy Andy, Helpy Selfie, and Jitney Jungle, all operating on variations of the self-service model. The counter was not gone yet, not in 1925. Most independent stores were still running the way they had always run. But the idea had been introduced, and it was spreading, and the grocer behind his counter was already, whether he knew it or not, occupying a disappearing world.
Imagine a morning in late autumn. A storm came through overnight. Not catastrophic, but enough. Roads muddy, one bridge briefly impassable, a rail line delayed outside of town. The delivery that should have arrived by 8 in the morning has not come. The grocer opens the store knowing that his flour is low, sugar is running short, coffee beans are down to the last portion of the sack. He has a town to feed and the tools are not there. Customers arrive anyway. They ask for what they always ask for, because life does not pause for supply chains. A woman with 4 children at home needs flour. She is not interested in supply chain disruptions, she needs to make bread. A man who has been working since 5 in the morning wants coffee. A family preparing for a Sunday dinner needs staples that are not on the shelf. The grocer cannot conjure goods, he can only manage what remains. He begins to limit sales, smaller amounts per customer, so that more families receive something rather than fewer families receiving everything. He suggests substitutions. He keeps his voice steady because anxiety is contagious in a small room and his customers can read him like a text. If he looks worried, the worry spreads. If he seems certain, a certain kind of calm holds. He tries to reach his wholesaler by telephone, still a relatively new tool in many small American towns in 1925. He may have a phone on the wall behind the counter, a shared line connected to a local exchange. He may need to wait for a clear connection, or send a message, or simply wait and hope the delay resolves itself. There is nothing else to do. This is the other face of the intimate system. Its strength, the personal relationship, the local knowledge, the flexibility, was inseparable from its fragility. A modern supply chain fails with notifications and reroutes. A 1925 supply chain fails with an empty barrel and a family standing at the counter asking for flour. When the shipment finally arrives, perhaps mid-afternoon, perhaps the following morning, the relief is physical. The grocer unloads quickly, checks every item, moves the stock into place. He may have customers waiting who heard the wagon or the truck arrive. The store fills again, not because of advertising, but because of necessity. Scarcity had announced itself, and now abundance, relative and brief, had returned. The town noticed both.
Saturday was different. In towns built around factories, mills, and farms, Saturday was the day the week compressed into a few hours. Workers who had kept their purchases minimal through the week came in for larger amounts. Farmers drove in from surrounding roads. Children were sent with wests. Housewives arrived earlier than usual. The bell above the door rang again and again until it became part of the town's acoustic landscape. The grocer and whatever help he had, perhaps a teenage clerk, perhaps his wife, perhaps an older son, moved with a choreography built from repetition. One person weighing and wrapping, another fetching from the back. Orders lined up on the counter in bundles. Accounts updated in the ledger. Change counted from the drawer. Saturday was also when people bought slightly beyond the minimum. A tin of cocoa for a cold evening. A jar of jam to stretch bread into something that felt like dessert.
a small bag of hard candy for children who had been patient, a larger cut of smoked ham because Sunday dinner had a different meaning than Tuesday dinner. It was the meal that the family sat down to together, that took time to prepare, that marked the end of the working week and the beginning of something briefly slower. These purchases were small by any modern standard. A tin of cocoa cost a few cents. A quarter pound of tea was a considered expense. But the meaning attached to each item was not small. The ability to buy a little extra on Saturday, to feel for a moment that the household was not simply surviving, but had a small margin of pleasure, mattered in ways that budgets do not fully capture. The grocer saw all of it. He saw who bought the cocoa and who asked quietly for just a smaller portion than they had last week. He saw which families were pulling back and which were holding steady. He saw it not because he was watching for it, but because he was there, and because in 1925, a town's life was visible in ways that modern life is not.
By late afternoon, the pace changed. The bell rang less, the counter was quieter. The grocer could finally move without interruption, which meant he could see the actual state of things. What was low, what had not sold, what would not keep until Monday. Closing was not simply locking the door. It was an accounting of the day that was also an accounting of the week and, in some sense, of the life. He checked the produce. Bruised apples were removed. Vegetables that had softened too much to sell were set aside, taken home, given to a neighbor, composted. Waste meant money gone, and money gone meant less for the family he was feeding at the same time as the town. He wiped surfaces, swept flour dust from the floor, covered the open bins, secured the sacks against mice, which were a constant pressure in any building that stored grain. The grocer's war against pests was quiet and ongoing and never entirely won. Then he turned to the ledger. He reviewed the day's entries, checked who had paid and who had not, made mental notes about accounts that were stretching long, counted the cash in the drawer, coins stacked, bills arranged, the day's transactions converted into a number that would either provide or not provide for the week ahead. There was no electronic record, there was no cloud backup. There was what was written in the ledger and what was in the drawer, and the grocer carried the rest in his head. He might grind coffee for the morning, he might refill jars, he might write an order to send to the wholesaler by telephone in the morning. The store was never truly finished, it was a living thing, continuously requiring attention. And somewhere in the back of his mind, always, was the question he could not answer with certainty. Would the customers come back tomorrow? Would the payment from that family come in before the end of the month? Would the shipment of flour arrive on time? The grocer who did this work was not heroic in any obvious way. He was not famous. He did not appear in newspapers unless something went wrong. He was simply the person who stood at the center of the neighborhood's food supply, every day for years until he retired or sold or died and someone else took his place. He was the system.
The world that produced the 1925 grocery store did not end suddenly. It was displaced by a series of changes that each seemed reasonable, even inevitable, taken one at a time. Refrigeration changed what a household could store, which changed how often they needed to shop, which changed the economics of the small neighborhood store. A family with a refrigerator could buy a week's worth of food in one trip. The daily visit became unnecessary. The store that had relied on constant, frequent contact with a small cluster of families found that contact becoming irregular and then rare. The automobile changed distance. A family with a car was no longer limited to the grocery store within walking range. They could drive to a larger store with lower prices and more selection. The neighborhood store's geographical advantage, being close, was negated the moment transportation improved enough to make close irrelevant. Packaged goods changed trust. Instead of trusting the grocer to measure correctly, customers began trusting brands and factories. A bag of nationally advertised flour was consistent in weight and quality from one purchase to the next. The grocer's hands were no longer part of the guarantee.
The brand was. Clarence Saunders had seen this coming in 1916. Self-service removed the clerk from the transaction and made packaging and branding do the work the clerk used to do. When you cannot ask the grocer to describe the cheese, the label on the package has to do it. The store's environment had to communicate what the grocer's voice used to communicate. By 1930, King Cullen had opened in Queens, New York, widely regarded as the first true American supermarket. Large footprint, massive selection, parking, low prices achieved through volume. By the end of that decade, the template was clear. The neighborhood store that had fed American towns for generations was not dead, but it was diminishing. A&P alone had helped close thousands of independent grocers in the 1920s, not through malice, but simply by offering lower prices that most independent operators, with their credit accounts and delivery routes and single-person operations, could not match. Something went with those closures. Not everything. The independent grocer was not without flaws. He was a gatekeeper, and gatekeepers can be unfair. The ledger gave him power over families in ways that were not always used with grace. In some communities, certain customers were charged more than others. In some towns, access to credit depended on social standing. The intimacy of the system was real, and so was the coercion that could hide inside intimacy. But something genuine was lost when shopping became anonymous. When the store no longer knew your name, it no longer noticed when you were struggling. It offered discounts, not discretion. It offered a system, not a relationship. The grocer who quietly added an extra potato to a bag because he had watched a family through a difficult season, that person was not replaceable by a loyalty card and a coupon in a Sunday newspaper. Economic historian Mark Levinson, writing about the rise of A&P, captured the tension precisely. People grew nostalgic for the independent store, but the truth, he noted, was complicated. Most of those stores had limited selection, uncertain quality, and prices that the chains beat without difficulty. The nostalgia was for something real, the personal knowledge, the community function that existed alongside genuine inadequacies. Both were true simultaneously.
The bell above the door has not rung in a while. The last customer left before the light changed. The counter is clean, the bins are covered, the ledger is closed on its shelf. Outside, the town continues in the way of all towns. People walking home with bundles, meals being prepared, children being called inside for supper. The system that fed this town in 1925 is not remembered for its efficiency, because it was not especially efficient. It is remembered, when it is remembered at all, for the texture of its human presence. The grocer who knew your family, the scale that required honesty, the ledger that held a neighborhood's private arithmetic. It was a system built on repeated contact between specific people in a specific place, and that contact created something that larger systems have spent a century trying to replicate with technology and failing to fully capture. The average urban family of 1925 spent 1/3 of its income at a store like this one. They came several times a week. They handed their requests across a wooden counter and received them back, wrapped, weighed, recorded. They paid when they could and promised when they couldn't, and the grocer wrote it down and waited. That was the deal. Informal, unenforceable, dependent entirely on the character of the people involved. It worked because it had to, and when it stopped being necessary, when refrigerators and automobiles and chain stores and packaged goods made it possible to do things differently, it stopped. Not because anyone decided to end it, but because the conditions that had made it necessary had changed, and systems built on necessity dissolve when the necessity does. What remains is the memory of it, the creak of a floorboard, the ring of a bell, the smell of coffee being ground to order, the weight of a paper bundle in your hands as you push the door open and step back out into a town that for now still knows your name.